When the widow Maeve fed a starving wild stallion that collapsed on her land, she thought it was nothing more than a private act of mercy on the longest night of the year. She had no way of knowing that before the sun fully cleared the mountains, that horse would activate something ancient, something deliberate, and leave 200 ranchers of the Colorado high country standing in the cold with their certainties completely broken. What secret did that creature carry out of the wilderness? And why did it matter enough for someone to try to kill him for it? Before we go into what happened that night at Timberline Ranch, there is a question I want to sit with you for a moment. You have seen animals do extraordinary things. You have read the stories, maybe dismissed some of them. But what if an animal was not acting on instinct at all? What if it had been a witness? What if something wild and wordless had seen exactly what humans had spent months trying to hide, and knew, in whatever way a horse can know, that the only way to expose it was to walk through fire to reach the one person who might listen? That is the question at the heart of what happened in Elk Basin County in the winter of this story. And it begins, as most of the truest things do, with a woman alone in the dark. If this kind of story stays with you, if you believe that the land has a memory and that justice sometimes arrives on four legs, hit the like button now and subscribe so you never miss another. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or town you are watching from. Let us know you are here. And now, back to the night Maeve found Sovereign. The Timberline Ranch sits at 7,200 feet in the San Juan foothills, and it has been bleeding money for 3 years the way old wounds bleed, slowly, steadily, in a way you almost stop noticing until you look down and realize you are standing in it. Maeve Callahan, 44 years old, had worked the property alongside her husband Daniel for 19 years. They had 300 acres in pasture, a small but stubborn cattle operation, and a water rights agreement with the county that had kept them solvent through 2 previous droughts. She had a degree she rarely mentioned, environmental forensics from Colorado State, earned before ranching became her life, and a reputation in the valley for being the kind of person who noticed things other people preferred not to notice. Daniel had been dead for 11 months. The official report said cardiac event. Maeve did not believe the official report. Daniel had been 47, ran 4 miles every morning, and had spent the last 3 months of his life compiling a folder of photographs, water sample results, and GPS coordinates that he was preparing to deliver to the State Department of Agriculture. He told Maeve the night before he died that someone had rerouted the secondary irrigation channel, the one that fed 8 properties including theirs, and that the rerouting was not accidental. He was found in the barn the next morning. The folder was not found at all. The name that kept surfacing in the valley, spoken carefully and usually not completed, was Slater. Harlan Slater owned Crestline Agricultural Holdings, which had purchased 6 of the 17 original ranching families out of Elk Basin in the past 4 years. He was not from here. He wore clean boots. He donated money to the county fair and shook hands with the sheriff and had a lawyer named Kendrick who arrived at disputes before the dispute was fully spoken aloud. The mechanism was simple and ugly. The drought had been genuinely severe. That part was real. But the water shortages affecting the smaller operations in the lower basin were not entirely natural. They were assisted. Crestline had applied for and received emergency permits to expand a series of collection basins on the eastern ridge, and those basins, by design or by consequence, interrupted the natural flow patterns that had served the valley for over a century. When the small ranchers went to the county, they were met with paperwork. When they hired their own attorneys, they were met with more paperwork. When their cattle began losing weight and their pastures went brown and their credit dried up, they were met with an offer from Crestline. Always fair, always firm, always the same amount below what the land was actually worth. Maeve had not sold, not because she was not afraid, but because selling felt like agreeing that Daniel had died for nothing. She had spent the 11 months since his death keeping the operation running on muscle and stubbornness, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating when she remembered to, and going through what remained of Daniel's research in the hours when the work was done. She had reconstructed most of the folder from his email drafts, and from her own memory of what he had shown her. It lived on her laptop in an encrypted folder she backed up to 2 separate drives. She had not yet figured out what to do with it, who to trust, whether the trust would matter. The night she found Sovereign, she had not been sleeping because she had been reading through a new set of water analysis results from a private lab in Denver. Results she had submitted herself, drawn from the creek that ran along the south fence line. The numbers were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Heavy metals at concentrations that had no agricultural explanation. She had been sitting with that knowledge for 3 hours, turning it in her mind, when she heard the sound from the yard. Not a noise exactly, more like a weight settling. She put her coat on and went outside. The stallion was black and enormous and near death. He was collapsed against the corner post of the outer fence, his breathing a wet, effortful rasp. The welts on his neck were fresh enough that the edges had not yet crusted over. His hooves were cracked and packed with debris, and his coat, beneath the grime, had the particular dullness of prolonged malnutrition. He did not flinch when she crouched beside him. He watched her with one enormous dark eye, and the look in it was not the wild thing's panic. It was something Maeve could only describe, later, as recognition. She went back to the barn for her emergency feed supply, high-density pellets fortified with electrolytes, a bag of Timothy hay, and 3 5-gallon buckets of filtered water from the cistern. She moved slowly, talking in the low continuous murmur she used with frightened animals. The stallion drank twice from the first bucket before she had finished pouring the second. He ate carefully, tentatively, as if his body had forgotten the mechanics of nutrition and needed to be reminded. By 1 in the morning, he was standing. Maeve stood with him, her hand flat on the broad plane of his shoulder, and felt the trembling in his muscles subside by degrees. She did not understand, standing there in the dark, how much was already set in motion. She only knew that she was not going back inside. Not yet. Something about the way he had arrived, without sound, without the crash and scramble of a wild animal encountering a fence, felt deliberate in a way she could not explain. She named him Sovereign before she had a reason to. The name arrived fully formed, the way the right names sometimes do. She did not go back to her laptop until dawn, and by then, everything had changed. The work of cleaning a horse's wounds is intimate in a way that most people do not expect. You move slowly. You stay low. You earn the right to touch each new place by being quiet and consistent in the place before it. Maeve worked through the night, a bucket of warm saline and a stack of folded cloths beside her. She cleaned the welts on the neck first, and as she worked through the matted coat around them, her hands slowed. She moved the lantern closer. The base of the mane, on the left side of the neck, had been recently clipped, not in a way that was visible at a glance, but the hair in that area was shorter than the surrounding coat by about 2 centimeters, and the skin beneath it was paler than the rest, the way skin looks after a healing burn. She used her thumbnail to part the coat carefully, following the line of the clipping, and found it, a Frise brand approximately 3 inches long, the pale hair grown back just enough to blur but not conceal the alphanumeric code beneath it. She had seen Frise brands before. They were standard practice for federal horse management. The Bureau of Land Management used them on Mustangs processed through the Wild Horse and Burro program. The nitrogen application bleached the pigment cells in the skin, producing a permanent white marking. Standard BLM codes ran in a specific format, the APHA alpha angle symbol for registration, followed by the year and a 4-digit identifier. This brand had a different structure. The first 4 characters matched BLM formatting, but the last 6 were not year-end identifier. They were a code she did not immediately recognize. 3 letters, 3 numbers, in a sequence that meant nothing to her until she went inside and sat down at her laptop. She knew the BLM maintained a public registry of Frise-branded Mustangs. She also knew, from Daniel's research, that Crestline had applied for and received 2 commercial capture permits in the previous 18 months. Paperwork she had found in a state agricultural database and copied into her own files. The permits were for the removal of feral horses from properties adjacent to Crestline's eastern expansion operations, filed under a nuisance abatement provision. She cross-referenced the code. The public registry returned nothing. The code did not exist in the federal system. She sat with that for a moment. Then she opened a secondary database, a less trafficked interface that Daniel had bookmarked, a research access portal maintained by the Colorado State Animal Science Department. She had his login credentials from an old sticky note she had found in his desk drawer and never thrown away. Here, the code resolved. The entry was brief and clinical. The animal had been removed from federal open range under a Crestline corporate capture permit 14 months prior. The permit cited rangeland degradation. The notation following the capture date read, transferred to Crestline AG Holdings Research Division, Pozo Creek Site. Behavioral and physiological monitoring. Project Thornfield. Access restricted, Corporate Research Designation 7. Maeve read the words Project Thornfield 3 times. She went back to her water analysis results from the Denver lab. The contamination readings, the heavy metal concentrations that had no agricultural explanation, were drawn from the creek that ran directly south of the Pozo Creek property line. She opened her browser and searched for everything attached to Pozo Creek and Crestline. The property was listed as a secondary operations facility. No public description, no regulatory filings beyond the standard environmental impact waiver that Kendrick's firm had apparently processed in a single week. Satellite imagery from 18 months prior showed a fenced perimeter enclosing what appeared to be a series of containment structures and at least 2 large excavated areas. The most recent satellite image showed the same structures, but the surrounding ground vegetation had changed color in a pattern she recognized from contamination case studies. The yellowing, the geometric regularity of it, the way it did not match drought stress. The waste was in the ground, and the ground drained into the water table. She sat back. Sovereign had been kept at Pozo Creek. He had been used, in the particular bureaucratic language of Project Thornfield, for physiological monitoring, which, translated from the corporate research euphemism, meant he had been exposed to the contaminated water and observed for symptoms. He was a test subject. He had survived something that should have killed him, and he had escaped, or been released. She could not yet tell which. And he had walked, through 11 degrees of December cold, to the nearest fence line that had light behind it, the nearest person who might understand what he carried. Maeve closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to the horse breathe in the yard. The question was not what Sovereign knew. The question was what she was going to do with what she now knew, and how much time she had before the people who had branded him realized he was gone. She did not think it was much time at all. At 3:12 in the morning, Sovereign began to vocalize. It was not the flat alarm whinny of a frightened horse. It was something else, a low, reverberant call that he repeated at intervals of approximately 40 seconds, a rhythmic patterning that Maeve noticed because of its regularity. She had grown up around horses. She had never heard this. She stood at the barn door in her coat, watching him. He was standing near the fence line, his great head lifted, his ears tracking something far up the dark slope of the foothills. His nostrils were wide. He would call, and then stand perfectly still for 35 seconds, and then call again, tilting his head slightly, as if adjusting the angle of transmission. She thought of sonar. She thought of signals. 20 minutes later, headlights appeared on the county road, a single set, moving slowly. She stepped back into the shadow of the barn and watched. The truck stopped at the entrance to her access road, idled for a moment, and then turned in. She knew the truck, a battered green Ford with a dented tailgate and a county seal on the door that had been there since before the county changed its logo. It belonged to Garrick Poole, who had served as Justice of the Peace in Elk Basin County for 22 years and who had officially retired from that role 8 months ago, though everyone in the valley still called him Judge. He was 71 years old, built like a fence post that had decided to become permanent, and he had known Daniel Callahan since before Daniel had known Maeve. She walked out to meet him in the yard. He climbed out of the truck slowly, the way men with bad knees climb out of trucks, and looked at Sovereign without surprise. He looked at Sovereign the way you look at something you were expecting to see and had been hoping not to. "I saw the lights," he said. "I have been up," she said. He nodded. He looked at the horse again. Then he looked at her. "What do you know so far?" he said. It was not a question. She told him. All of it. The brand, the database entry, the water readings, the Pozo Creek satellite images. She spoke quickly and without decoration, the way she had been trained to present forensic data. Evidence first, interpretation after, confidence ratings on each claim. Garrick listened with his arms folded and his eyes on the horse. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "They will know he is gone by morning," he said. "I figured the same. Slater's operation out at Pozo Creek." He paused, and she could see him choosing what to say carefully. "There were things reported to me before I retired. Things I could not move on because the reporting party was your husband, and after Daniel died, there was no one left to corroborate." She felt the cold in her chest that was not from the air temperature. "You knew," she said. "I knew something wrong was happening. I did not know the shape of it, and I did not have Daniel's documentation. I have reconstructed most of it," she said. He looked at her then, fully, for the first time since he had climbed out of the truck. "How much?" "Enough." They stood in the yard, the frost forming on the wooden rails of the fence, Sovereign still calling at his intervals into the dark. Garrick spoke slowly. The reason Slater has been able to operate the way he has is that there is no physical evidence. The ranchers know their water changed. They know their cattle have been sick. They have watched their operations fail one by one, and they have told each other what they suspect. But suspicion is not enough to move a man like Slater. He has lawyers. He has permits. He has a relationship with the county assessor that I spent 2 years trying to untangle before I retired. What happened when you tried? I was told my jurisdiction was limited. Meaning someone called someone. She heard the weight under those words and did not push further. The valley had its internal gravity, its particular architecture of obligation and silence. She knew the shape of it, even if she could not name every piece. Sovereign called again into the dark hills. What is he doing? Garrick said. Calling the herd, she said. And that is when the understanding arrived in her. Not as a plan, but as a possibility. The way a door that has always been locked feels different when the key is actually in your hand. If the horses that had been at Pozo Creek were still alive, they were out there. And if they were out there, and if they came down. She did not finish the thought aloud, but she looked at the horse calling into the mountains, and she thought, what if the evidence was not only on a laptop? What if the evidence was moving? Harlan Slater did not sleep through a night if anything in his operation was misaligned. It was a quality he would have described as discipline, and that everyone around him recognized as fear. The fear of a man who had built something complicated and knew exactly how it would unravel. He received the alert at 4:08 in the morning. One of the location transponders on the Pozo Creek animals had gone dark approximately 7 hours prior. A gap in the signal log that his overnight monitoring contractor had failed to flag in real time. The transponder corresponded to the largest of the surviving subjects, the Black Stallion, capture tag designation T-14, the one they had spent 4 months trying to neutralize and couldn't, the one that had survived the contamination protocol not once, but twice, and kept recovering. He sat in his kitchen and stared at his phone. He called Kendrick first, then his ranch foreman, a man named Doss who handled operational problems without being asked for specifics. By 4:30 in the morning, he had made a decision that he would later recognize, in the specific retrospective clarity of a man watching his own ruin assemble, as the worst of his life. The decision was to move before the sun came up. He could not allow the animal to be found, examined, tested. The tissue samples alone, the residual biomarkers of prolonged heavy metal exposure, would tell a story that no lawyer could cross-examine. If that horse ended up in a veterinary laboratory, Project Thornfield would be over in the time it took to run a blood panel. And Project Thornfield was not merely a research designation. It was the entire evidentiary foundation of his contamination strategy, the one that allowed him to claim, in writing, that the Elk Basin water quality issues predated his company's presence in the valley. He needed the horse dead. He needed the Callahan woman neutralized. And he needed both of those things to happen in a way that looked like public health emergency response. Kendrick drafted the notices in 40 minutes. They went out by text and automated telephone at 5:15 in the morning. Every registered rancher in the county notification system, which covered 214 individual operations. The message cited an emergency advisory from the County Livestock Health Commission, an advisory that Kendrick had formatted to look official, complete with a copied commission seal, warning of a confirmed case of equine infectious anemia detected in a feral animal at large in the Elk Basin Valley. The carrier animal had been traced to the Timberline Ranch property. All neighboring livestock were at risk. A coordinated containment and euthanasia response would be assembled at first light at the Timberline Ranch entrance. It was Doss who pointed out the additional risk, that Maeve Callahan was not simply a widow sitting on a piece of land they wanted. Doss had done his research. He knew about the forensics degree. He knew about the laptop. He mentioned these things with the careful neutrality of a man describing a weather pattern that is going to require action. Slater authorized what Doss was describing without using words that could later be repeated in a deposition. By 5 in the morning, 2 trucks from Crestline's security division were parked on the county road, waiting. And Sovereign was still calling. Inside the Timberline Ranch, Maeve was not idle. She had spent the previous hour in a controlled, productive fury, uploading her complete documentation package to a secure server, emailing compressed copies to 2 addresses she trusted outside the valley, and preparing a secondary presentation, a visual summary of the contamination data, the BLM registry gaps, the the satellite imaging, and the brand identification formatted for a large display. She connected her laptop to the ranch's outdoor speaker system and the projector she used for calving season training. A portable unit that could throw an image onto the side of the barn or, she was thinking, onto the flat white panel of a truck door. She did not know yet that 200 trucks were coming, but she was operating on the assumption that when this broke, it would break in front of people, and those people would need to see evidence rather than be asked to believe it. Garrick watched her work. He said very little, which was his way of approving. At 5:43 in the morning, Sovereign stopped calling. The silence lasted 3 minutes. Then the fence line on the far eastern border of the property made a sound that Maeve heard even from inside the house. A long, percussive creak, the sound of old wood under pressure. She went to the window. Sovereign was gone. The gate to the inner pasture was open. He had worked the latch. She had seen horses do it before, but not with that kind of intent, not with the specific directional departure of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. He had gone up, into the dark of the mountain. She looked at Garrick. He looked at her. The headlights, he said, appearing on the county road below them in a chain that stretched as far as they could see. The sky at 6:40 in the morning in the San Juan foothills is a specific color. Not black, not blue, but a deep gray violet that sits behind the mountain silhouettes like a held breath. The temperature had dropped another 3 degrees. The frost on the fence rails had become ice. Maeve and Garrick stood on the porch of the Timberline Ranch house and watched the trucks arrive. 207 vehicles, she would count later. Pickups mostly, a few flatbeds, a handful of older sedans that belonged to the families who had sold their land but not yet left the county entirely. They came in from both directions on the county road and parked on the gravel verge in 2 ragged lines that stretched a quarter mile in each direction from the entrance. The headlights made a corridor of pale light pointing directly at the ranch gate. Harlan Slater arrived in a black Suburban at the head of the second wave, a megaphone in his hand and Kendrick at his shoulder. He was wearing a clean vest and a hat that suggested authority. He set up 30 yards from the gate and began speaking, his voice loud, practiced, calibrated for concern. This is a county health emergency. There is a confirmed carrier animal on this property. The risk of transmission to your herds is significant and the response timeline is critical. If you cooperated with the commission's advisory, you made the right choice by coming out here today. We are going to handle this quickly and responsibly. The ranchers stood beside their trucks. Most of them had come because they were afraid. Some had come because the valley's information networks ran fast, and they had heard things, second and third hand, across fence lines and over coffee, that made them distrust the message even as they responded to it. Some had come simply because 200 of your neighbors appearing somewhere in the dark before sunrise is the kind of thing that demands witness. Maeve walked to the gate. She did not open it. "Slater," she said. Her voice did not carry theatrically. It was a flat, contained sound that traveled because there was nothing competing with it. The crowd quieted. "There is no health advisory," she said. "There is no infectious anemia. You all know it, and I know it, and the man with the megaphone knows it best of all." Slater raised the megaphone again. "This woman is in denial about the risk." The ground moved. Not violently. Not a seismic event, but a vibration. A collective pressure transmitted through the frozen earth from a source to the north, up the slope, growing. The sound arrived next. Low, rhythmic, the particular percussion of a large group of animals moving at speed over hard ground. Every head turned toward the mountain. The ridge above the Timberline property was a long, gradual slope that ran from the eastern fence line up to the tree line. In summer, it was visible from the road. In the pre-dawn darkness, it was only a darker shape against a dark sky. But there was movement there, at the crest, a mass, a shifting, a series of forms that resolved slowly out of the dark as the sky behind them began, very gradually, to lighten. Sovereign came first. He appeared on the ridge line the way a figure appears in a doorway, with the sense of having been on the other side for a long time and having chosen this moment to step through. He was moving at a controlled canter, and behind him, in a wave that kept arriving, kept being larger than what the eye had prepared for, came the rest. A horse herd first. She would count 47 animals. Wild horses, all of them, the mixed-blood descendants of the high country range, moving in the organized formation of a group that had been running together for a long time. And then, behind the horses, the cattle. The cattle came in a stream that poured over the ridge like water, finding a channel. They moved with an urgency that was not panic, purposeful, directional, channeled by Sovereign's movement the way smaller animals are channeled by something they have decided to follow. They were lean but alive, their coats rough, their hooves worn from months of hard ground. And on their flanks, on the left hip of every single animal, a brand. Not one brand, not 5, dozens of different ranch brands, the particular marks of a dozen different families in the valley. But on the right hip of each animal, a second brand, applied over the original or beside it, a simple running C, the crestline mark. The animals that had been listed in insurance claims, declared dead by drought, the evidence for 7 different forced bankruptcies. They were walking down the mountain, alive, with the proof of who had taken them burned into their skin. The silence that fell over the crowd of 200 ranchers was the particular silence of people who are recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a situation. Then one man, Maeve could not immediately identify him in the dark, made a sound, not a word, a choked, involuntary noise, the kind a person makes when they see something they had given up believing they would ever see. His cattle, his brand, another voice, his, too. The chain reaction was quiet at first, spreading person by person along the line of trucks as people recognized the animals moving past, their own marks, the particular shapes of their own herds walking out of the dark toward them on 4 months of impossible absence. Slater had gone very still. What happened next took less than 20 minutes. It felt, to everyone present, like considerably longer. Maeve had prepared for a confrontation. She had not prepared for this, for the specific emotional weight of a crowd in the process of transformation. 200 people who had arrived afraid and angry and ready for a fight were now standing in the cold, watching dead things return to life, and the calculus of what they were willing to believe was recalculating in real time. She opened the gate. Sovereign led the herd through, moving without hurry, and the horses and cattle flowed through the entrance of the Timberline Ranch and spread across the front pasture in a broad, unhurried wave. The ranchers stepped back from the fence to make room. Some of them reached through the rails. Some of them simply stood and watched, as if reaching would break something. Slater found his voice. This is a staged event. He raised the megaphone. That brand can be applied to any animal. This woman and whoever is helping her have manufactured. Maeve had already connected her laptop to the projector and run the cable to the outdoor speaker system. The first image went up on the broad white panel of the hay barn wall. The water analysis results from the Denver lab, time-stamped, with the lab certification clearly legible. The second image, the satellite photographs of the Pozo Creek facility, with the discolored vegetation mapped in yellow overlay. The third, the BLM database entry for Sovereign, with the Project Thornfield designation and the Corporate Research Designation 7 restriction. She spoke into the ranch's PA microphone, and her voice came out of the speakers across the yard in a steady, measured register. These are water samples drawn from the South Creek on this property in November of this year. The contamination levels you are looking at are consistent with industrial chemical runoff, specifically chromium and manganese compounds used in the extraction and processing operations that Crestline has been running from the Pozo Creek site for the past 22 months. This water flows into the basin aquifer. It has been flowing there long enough to affect the water table under every ranch in the lower basin. She advanced the slide. This is the entry for the horse you see standing in my pasture right now, pulled from a restricted Colorado State Research database. He was captured under a Crestline commercial permit, transported to the Pozo Creek facility, and enrolled in a physiological monitoring program, meaning he was exposed to the contaminated water and observed for symptoms. The program is called Project Thornfield. It has no public regulatory filing. It has never been disclosed to the county assessor, the state agriculture board, or the EPA. She advanced again. The following slide contains documentation of 7 insurance claims filed by Crestline Agricultural Holdings in the past 18 months, each listing specific cattle as deceased due to drought-related health failure. The brands on those animals are visible in the pasture behind me. You can check them against the claim documents if you would like to. The claim documents are included in the packet Garrick is going to pass to each of you. Garrick, who had spent the previous hour printing copies of the summary package from the ranch's inkjet printer, began walking along the line of trucks, handing papers through windows and over fence rails. The megaphone had gone silent. Maeve looked at Slater across the distance. He was a man who had spent years operating in the space between what could be proven and what was known, and that space had just closed. She watched him understand it. There was a moment. She would remember it later as the stillest moment of the entire night, where he simply stood, the megaphone at his side, looking at the cattle in the pasture, the papers in the rancher's hands, the images on the barn wall. His face did not collapse into guilt. It contracted, the way something contracts when it is deciding whether to attack. He moved toward the barn, toward the projector, toward the laptop. He did not make it 3 steps. It was not a dramatic intervention. It was quiet, the way things are quiet when they are completely certain. 3 ranchers, men who had been standing nearest to where Slater was moving, simply stepped into his path and stood there. One of them was the man who had made the choked sound when he recognized his cattle. His name was Hector Vidal, and he had lost 42 head in the spring, and his family's claim had been denied, and his property was currently 6 weeks from foreclosure. He did not speak. He just stood where he was standing. Slater reached for the inside of his vest. The gun was there, a short-barreled revolver that he had carried for years as an affectation and now reached for as a desperate act of arithmetic. If he destroyed the laptop, if he got the horse off the property. Hector's hand closed on Slater's wrist before the gun cleared the vest. 2 other hands joined it, then 2 more. Nobody hit him. Nobody needed to. The weight of 200 people who had finally oriented toward the same understanding was more than enough to hold one man in place. Garrick walked through the gate with the measured pace of a man who has been waiting for this specific moment for a long time and is not going to rush it now that it has arrived. He stood in front of Harlan Slater and looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Harlan," he said, "you are under arrest. Fraud, grand larceny of livestock, criminal contamination of a public water supply, and conspiracy to obstruct a prior investigation. You have the right to remain silent." He paused. "I would strongly recommend you exercise it." The security contractors from Crestline, the 2 trucks that had been parked on the county road, had driven away sometime in the past 10 minutes. Nobody had watched them go. Kendrick was making a phone call with his back to the crowd, speaking in a low, rapid voice into his cell phone, and the particular quality of the conversation suggested that he was in the process of discovering how quickly a corporate attorney can become unavailable to a client when the situation changes. Sovereign stood in the middle of the front pasture. The herd had settled around him. The horses circled, the cattle spreading out into the available space. His head was raised. His breathing was even. He was watching something in the middle distance that none of the humans could see. The sky above the peaks was turning from gray violet to pale gold. The sun was not yet visible, but it was close. The frost on everything was lit now, the way frost is lit just before sunrise, each crystal throwing its own small light. So the entire yard seemed to be generating its own illumination from the ground up. A woman near the back of the crowd began to cry. Not loudly. Just the particular helpless release of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told they could put it down. Maeve stood at the gate of the Timberline Ranch, the microphone in her hand, looking at the pasture full of living proof, and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Not triumph, not relief, something older than both of those. Something that had Daniel's shape in it, and her father's, and the particular smell of the valley in summer when the water ran clean and the pastures were full. She put the microphone down. She walked into the pasture and put her hand on Sovereign's neck. He leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. The state authorities arrived at Timberline Ranch at 8:47 that morning. A Colorado Bureau of Investigation team accompanied by 2 EPA regional investigators who had, as it emerged, been building their own case against Crestline for the past 8 months, and had been waiting for precisely the kind of corroborating evidence that Maeve's documentation provided. Slater was in custody before 9. Kendrick was in custody before noon, having made the specific legal error of attempting to communicate with a regulatory official while standing on a crime scene. It was the kind of mistake that very competent attorneys make when they stop being attorneys and start being participants. The Pozo Creek facility was sealed by federal injunction within 48 hours. The excavated disposal sites, 3 of them, it turned out, not 2 as the satellite images had suggested, were designated as Superfund cleanup sites within 6 weeks, a process that moved with unusual speed and was later attributed to the fact that the EPA had been aware of the Crestline situation and had been frustrated by the absence of complainants willing to go on record. The 200 ranchers were now very much on record. The criminal case against Slater took 11 months to prepare and resulted in 23 charges, fraud, livestock theft, criminal water contamination, bribery of a public official, and one charge that received particular attention in the state press. The charge most closely related to Daniel Callahan's death. It was not a murder charge. The evidentiary threshold for that designation was not quite reachable, and Maeve had understood this from the beginning. What the investigation established was criminal negligence resulting in death. Daniel had been exposed, over the course of 4 months, to the same contaminated water supply that had been used in Project Thornfield. The heavy metal concentrations in the basin aquifer, the ones that had caused the cardiovascular stress markers identified in his autopsy, the ones that the original medical examiner had attributed to undisclosed hypertension, were consistent with the exposure profile that Crestline's own internal research documents recorded in the horses at Pozo Creek. The company had known the water was toxic. They had tested its effects on animals, and they had continued to allow it to seep into the aquifer while the people of Elk Basin drank from it, cooked with it, watered their cattle with it, and sometimes, as in Daniel's case, died from what the world was told was natural causes. Slater was sentenced to 14 years. The Crestline assets, the 6 purchased ranches, the Pozo Creek facility, the equipment, and the substantial liquid reserves in the corporate accounts were placed in a receivership administered by the state. The court-ordered restitution distributed those assets according to a formula developed over 4 months of negotiation involving every affected ranching family in the basin. Each family received their land back at assessed value, plus a contamination damages payment, plus a remediation fund allocation. Most of the families came home. The insurance companies that had paid out on the fraudulent livestock claims pursued Slater through a separate civil track and recovered enough to offset the majority of their exposure. This made the insurance companies briefly sympathetic figures in the valley, a reputation they did not sustain for long, but that served its purpose. Maeve sat through all of it: the depositions, the grand jury sessions, the federal interviews, the civil proceedings. She answered every question with the same quality she had brought to everything since the night she found Sovereign. Precisely, completely, with her evidence organized and her emotions handled in private. She did not attend Slater's sentencing. She stayed on the ranch that day and worked the fence line. When she came in at dusk and washed her hands at the kitchen sink, she stood for a moment looking at the water. Then she drank a glass of it, straight from the tap, tasting something that was not quite relief and not quite peace, but was moving in the direction of both. Spring came to the San Juan foothills differently that year. The remediation work began in March, a joint effort coordinated by the EPA and the Colorado Department of Public Health, with Maeve serving as the county's appointed environmental consultant. The Pozo Creek sites required heavy equipment and specialized contractors, and the excavation and soil replacement work would continue for 3 years. But the aquifer, once the source of contamination was sealed and removed, began to recover more quickly than the initial models had predicted. By April, the water testing along the South Creek showed a downward trend in metal concentrations. By June, the readings were within acceptable range for the first time in 3 years. The pastures came back. There is a particular quality to a valley recovering from a wound, a slow, unannounced return of things that were absent. The grasses come back in patches first, ragged and tentative, spreading over weeks into a green that eventually covers what was brown. The insects return, then the birds that follow the insects. The cattle, back on their own land now, found the rhythm of the seasons with the uncomplicated patience of animals that do not hold grudges about geography. The Timberline Ranch was rebuilt in stages. The collaboration came organically. The ranchers who had been Maeve's antagonists on that cold December morning arriving in May and June with tools and lumber, and the particular quiet industry of people working off a debt they cannot verbalize. Hector Vidal organized the fence replacement. A man named Clyde Ostrander donated the materials for a new water cistern. A woman named B. Fontaine, who ran the property 2 miles east and had lost her breeding stock to Slater's fraudulent claims, arrived one afternoon with a team of 5 and rebuilt the hay barn roof in a single day. Maeve accepted all of it without ceremony. She fed people and kept coffee going and worked alongside them and said thank you without turning it into something larger than it was. She was not comfortable with gratitude at scale, but she had learned, in the year since the December confrontation, to receive it without flinching. She had learned this the same way she had learned most of the useful things in her life, by having no alternative and deciding to do it well. Garrett came by most mornings. He had no official role in the county anymore, but the new county water board had invited him to serve as a senior advisor, and he had accepted with the manner of a man who had not actually stopped working but had simply been between assignments. He and Maeve had developed the specific, easy silence of people who have been through something together that they will never completely describe to anyone who was not there. They drank coffee on the porch and looked at the mountains and talked about the water data, and occasionally did not talk at all, which was also a form of conversation. The horses were not seen in the valley again. Sovereign's herd returned to the high country after that December morning, disappearing into the upper wilderness with the matter-of-fact finality of wild things who have completed what they came to do. There were occasional sightings over the following months. A dark shape on the eastern ridge at dusk, a trail of tracks in the snow that led up and not down, but the herd stayed in the high country. Maeve found herself, in odd moments, scanning the ridge line without intending to. She had filed the Project Thornfield data with the BLM's Wild Horse and Burro program along with a formal complaint about the commercial capture permits that had allowed Sovereign's capture. The program's response was the slow, churning kind of institutional response that she had expected and planned for. A review was opened. An internal audit was initiated. She had no illusions about the timeline, but she had made sure the documentation was in permanent record, and permanent records were something she had learned to trust. The county offered her the environmental consultant role formally in September, salaried, with an office in the county building and access to the state monitoring systems. She accepted on the condition that the position included independent data authority, that she would report findings to the state and federal level without county review. The commissioners, who were operating in the particular chastened mode of officials who had survived a scandal adjacent to their jurisdiction, agreed without argument. She was building something. Not quickly, and not without cost, but with the particular solidity of construction that starts from the ground rather than from the top. She thought about Daniel most in the early mornings, before the work began. She would stand at the kitchen window with her coffee and look at the spot by the outer fence where she had found Sovereign, and she would think about the folder Daniel had been building, the photographs and the water samples, and the GPS coordinates that had disappeared the night he died, and that she had spent a year reconstructing from fragments. She thought about the fact that he had been right, that the truth he had been trying to document had been real and present and provable, and that it had cost him everything. She did not know how to make peace with that. She had not tried to exactly. She had decided instead to make it mean something, which was different and harder and more durable. The last snow of winter fell on the Elk Basin foothills on a Tuesday morning in late March, and by afternoon it had already begun to melt, not the catastrophic melt of a warm front, but the slow, considered withdrawal of a season that has done what it came to do and is ready to make room. Maeve was at the new fence line on the northern border of the property, checking the post settings with Garrick when she heard it. Not the sound exactly, more the pressure of it, a change in the way the air was moving on the ridge. She looked up. Sovereign was there. Alone this time, standing on the flat rock shelf at the edge of the tree line, for 100 yards up the slope, still as something painted. Watching. She did not call out. She did not move toward him. She walked to the fence and held out her hand, open, the way she had held it out on a December night 11 degrees below freezing, with a bucket of fortified feed and nothing to offer but attention. He came down, slowly, without hurry, the way a horse comes when it has made a decision and is at peace with it. He stopped at the fence line and put his nose into her hand. The breath came out of him in a plume of white vapor that dissolved before it reached her shoulder. She could feel the familiar warmth of him, the specific temperature of a large animal that is well and rested and moving under its own authority. She let him take what was there, a handful of grain from her jacket pocket, the last of a batch she had been carrying since morning with no particular plan. He ate it. He raised his head and looked at her, and the look was not the wild thing's assessment of threat. It was something closer to recognition, and she held it for the 3 or 4 seconds it lasted, and then he turned. He went back up the mountain in his own time, unhurried, until the tree line closed around him and the ridge was bare again, and the valley below was just the valley, the water running clean, the pastures beginning to green, the smoke from a dozen ranch chimneys threading up into the cold, clear air. The truth has its own voice, she thought, and sometimes it needs a body to carry it. She turned back to the fence. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and for the first time in a long time, that did not feel like a sentence. It felt like a life. If this story stayed with you, if Sovereign's journey from the edge of death to the ridge of the mountain, and Maeve's quiet ferocity in the face of everything that tried to bury the truth, moved something in you, then hit the like button and let that feeling matter. Subscribe so you are here the next time a story like this arrives. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from, and tell us which moment broke you open. Was it when Sovereign came down the mountain leading what was thought to be lost? Was it when Garrick spoke those calm, devastating words? Or was it the very beginning, a woman alone in the dark and a horse that chose her? We read every single comment. We are here because of you. See you in the next story.